Радий вас
I
вітати.
think we can start. Good evening, everyone. We're happy to welcome you to one of our regular meetings. The topic of our today's meeting is the stress and trauma and intervention strategies through PTSD. We are having Dave Ricks today with us, David Ricks, PhD, Uniformed Services University of the Health Science, Professor of Medical and Clinical Psychology, Director, Center for the Deployment Psychology. Also, we have James Martin with us. The interpreting is available if you need Ukrainian interpreting. Please click on the globe side sign and choose the respective channel, English or Ukrainian. If you want to listen to the lecture in the original, use English channel. The duration of the lecture will be about 1 hour, and after that we will have about half an hour for Q&A session. So you can either raise your hand to ask a question. There is such an option on the panel, and I will enable your microphone to ask your question. Or you also have an option to write your question in the chat, and we will read them out. This meeting is being recorded. We didn't publish the latest 2 lectures, and I think we will publish all 3 of them, and you will be able to find them at 4 post channel and social media platforms. So I am happy to give the floor to our lecturer. Dave, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. First, just an apology. Apparently, as my wife has told me on many occasions, I'm too verbose, and so I had produced many slides, enough that those who invited me asked me to split it into 2 talks. So today we will focus on intervention strategies primarily shortly after a traumatic event, and then I will come back at another date and we will focus on the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So just so everybody is anticipating accurately what we will try and cover today. So if I can get to the next slide, the first thing I need to do is offer a disclaimer. I work for the Uniformed Services University, which belongs to the United States Department of Defense, but I don't speak for either the university or the Department of Defense, nor the US government when I give these lectures. So if I say something particularly stupid, it's all on me. The next slide, please. I work and direct the Center for Deployment Psychology. Many of the slides that I will present today were developed by my colleagues there, and I want to give them credit. So Drs. Kelly Cressman, Paula Dominici, Karen Lefkowitz all work for our center, and they provided many of the slides that I'll be using today and with my next lecture as well. And Patricia Watson, who works for the Veterans Administration National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, also contributed slides. So I want to acknowledge all of their fine work. Next slide, please. As we think about stress and trauma, I tend to think of this on a continuum. We all experience stress of various levels. At some point, it crosses an imaginary line and we call it trauma. There are obviously different ways people define trauma. and I will talk about a few of those, but many of the reactions that I will describe and that I'll discuss in terms of steps that might be taken to mitigate them uh, apply even with stress that one experiences that falls short of that line that crosses into trauma. So I want to encourage as I speak and as you and I speak during the question and answers that you think about the opportunity to use much of the information not only in the context of trauma but also more broadly as we deal with stress that might not reach that level. Next slide, please. This is a list that was developed a number of years ago, shortly after our military deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s. It's actually taken from a pamphlet that was shared with military leaders, with line leaders, to inform them about the stress that is often experienced in combat situations and what they might expect among their troops. I'm not going to go through each of the items on the list, but just highlight that fear and confusion are always present in combat situations. One will lose unit members and friends. Often there are perceptions that leaders are failing troops in one way or another. And one that has received particular attention of late, at least for our military, is the role of moral and ethical challenges that occur when you put young men and women into combat situations. So we'll talk about many of these kind of in this context of combat, but highlighting that none of this is particularly new material. We've known all of this for a while, but thinking about how to address the stress of combat and the stress of trauma in the context of those events and when they're ongoing, that is a newer situation for many of us. Next slide, please. So this next slide illustrates much of what I'm going to try and cover today in the context of combat, where individuals are experiencing prolonged and intense stress. There are a number of ways that we can think about stress injuries occurring. So there's the common experience, or at least the one that's most written about probably is the idea of trauma, that when in these situations I experience something that results in my feeling intense fear or horror or helplessness, we experience trauma, and that often leads to what traditionally has been diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. But there are other ways that injuries happen in the context of large-scale traumas in combat. One is simple fatigue. We often think about the physical fatigue that goes along with experiencing trauma and combat, but mental fatigue as well occurs. And so we need to keep in mind that some of the challenges our folks may experience don't result necessarily from a traumatic event, but merely from existing under conditions of prolonged and intense stress for long periods of time. There are also loss-related injuries related to grief and the death that so often occurs. And then, as I mentioned before, this idea of moral injury, that there are things that happen on the battlefield and in other situations as well that either might cause me to take action or might cause me to witness others taking action that violates my sense of moral values. And that also appears to bring about significant emotional distress that will need to be addressed. So the next slide is simply the definition of trauma as it's used in the United States psychiatric diagnostic system. And I share this mostly to emphasize that there are many things that clients or patients may bring to us that they identify as trauma, which can be incredibly upsetting, but which fail to meet by the rule what it is that we call a trauma in order to make a diagnosis. And that doesn't mean that those individuals will be any less distressed or in any less need of help. But sometimes, excuse me, on our end at least, it raises questions as to what the best treatments are. And what I will say is, after years of working with trauma survivors and studying post-traumatic stress disorder, I will say that in many ways, the symptoms of PTSD mimic the normal human response to intense emotional experiences. And it's more that they persist over time that seems to create the problem. And so I work, when I'm teaching my students, I encourage them not to think in terms of, can I fit somebody into this box, but rather what is the distress or the pain that they're experiencing, and how can I use the tools I have to best address that without worrying about what label to place upon them. So next slide. I do want to talk a bit about this idea of moral injury. I have my own opinions about it. I actually don't know that it identifies things that are dramatically different than the experiences of many individuals who are diagnosed with PTSD. That is, the emotions that are typically associated with moral injury, which have to do with guilt or shame, often appear in individuals who have experienced traumas that have little or nothing to do with a sense of moral violation. So I think it's important to consider the types of events that can lead to this level of distress that don't involve direct threat of I'm going to die, which is how PTSD is typically characterized. But to understand that the presentation you see for people who are struggling with a moral injury may look very similar to the challenges or the difficulties that are presented by somebody who has PTSD. Next slide, please. There are a couple of kind of broad categories that researchers have identified relative to this idea of moral injury. One is an action, again, that either I have taken or perhaps that I witness others take that violates my sense of moral belief or moral values. But there's another, which is that someone who's in authority takes an action that is perceived of as a failure or a betrayal. And the first slide, the first content slide that I showed, I said that often there is a perception of failures in leadership that happens on the battlefield. And this is what Jonathan Shea was writing about, was the perception that that troops can have, often because they don't understand the larger stakes or the larger strategy, but what they experience is that somehow they have been let down by their leadership, and that experience can itself bring about a sense of moral injury. So, next slide, please. Regardless of kind of what the event is, human beings have varied reactions to these things that we call traumas or potential traumas. Some people will be affected by them greatly. Other people will be perhaps not affected by them much at all. And for some, those reactions will persist for a prolonged time, and for others, they may recover fairly rapidly on their own. And so this is just the idea of the prism is just that it's very hard to point to one reaction and say that is, that's the reaction that someone will have, or even the reaction that someone should have to such an event. Next slide, please, and I'll have you probably, yes. So there's a transition. If you'll just click again. When I work with psychologists and psychiatrists here in the States and talk about the presentation they're most likely to see in their clinics, it's a presentation that is characterized as a chronic PTSD presentation. That is, somebody experiences a trauma, they develop symptoms very shortly thereafter, and those symptoms persist over time. If you'll go to the next slide, there is a smaller number of patients who present with a different presentation, which is that they go through the traumatic event, they seem to have relatively few symptoms, and then at some later date, they develop and start to present with significant symptoms. We, in our populations here in the States, this delayed presentation is very unusual among survivors of civilian traumas, but more common among veterans of combat. And the way it's typically described is that they experience the trauma while they're in a combat setting. They persist and continue to function in that setting. And then some period of time, typically a few months after returning home, they begin to complain about symptoms, or more commonly, their friends and family members begin to complain about symptoms and identify problems, and then they may or may not enter into treatment. Next, please. The most common presentation generally, and not speaking of who shows up in our clinics, but the most common presentation generally is what we would call recovery. That is, someone goes through a traumatic event, they experience some symptoms for a period of time, and over time, they recover, they return to baseline without significant intervention from physicians or therapists. There also, next slide, please, is a presentation that people are beginning to explore more deeply in terms of research, which suggests that some individuals, after experiencing a trauma, perceive a sense of growth out of that event. Often this could be characterized as a way of trying to regain control over a situation that has felt out of control for a period of time. So the early research in this area had to do with parents who lost a child to a sudden death, often due to illness, and then took on as part of their, like, the next phase of their life, they took on efforts to remedy that disease. They would start a charity organization, for example, to raise money to do research in that field, and found that as a way of finding purpose in their life. And people have talked about that as post-traumatic growth. And interestingly, post-traumatic growth is not the opposite of post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, you tend to see more growth among those people who have more symptoms initially from the trauma. So there's still much to be learned about how these two things may work together. And then one more click, please, and you'll see that the curve that describes what many of my colleagues in uniform keep asking me, which is, how can we make people more resilient to trauma? How can we have them go through the trauma and feel perhaps a little disrupted, but return to being functional again without having to go through significant symptoms? And I would just say that I think we are still a ways away from figuring out how to have people go through these types of events and not be touched by them. And I'm not sure that that's exactly what we want anyway. So next slide, please. Just as a review back to the idea of how in the context of or these events happen in the context of prolonged stress. So if I can get you to flip to the next slide. This is borrowed from a article by Siddle and Grossman that talks about the impact of the intense emotional experience that human beings have when they're going through a trauma or an intensely emotional stressor. As their arousal level, here indicated by heart rate, increases, it changes the way that they process and react to the world around them. So initially we find as people's arousal level or fear level or emotional level increases, they lose certain fine motor skills, and then some more complex motor skills as they get even more aroused. And then we see, particularly up at high levels of arousal, it alters the way that their brains are processing information. And this often leads to kind of unique characteristics about memories related to trauma. They're often disorganized. They don't follow a narrative to allow them to kind of describe what happened. They almost jump from one event to another without connection. And we do think that some of the phenomenon we see that we identify as symptoms of PTSD are reflective of this alteration in the way that people process information when they are intensely aroused, when they're intensely emotional. And that can help us to understand the types of reactions that we see and the types of persistent problems that occur for some of our trauma survivors. The next slide, please. There are different ways that people have tried to construct or understand the challenges or problems people have subsequent to trauma. If I could get the next slide, please. So this is a continuum model that was developed by our military to try, again, to capture what they see in troops under conditions of combat stress. So our military at least likes to use red, yellow, and green. Green meaning systems are good and ready to go. Yellow means pay attention, things may be somewhat problematic, and red meaning stop. There may be there's a problem here. So we want our troops to be in the green, be able to operate under conditions of stress and in the face of trauma or combat, everyone will react. That's the expected human response, is that we will react to those sorts of situations. If those reactions become more intense or persist over time, we might talk about somebody being injured and even ill, which is the point at which we would begin to diagnose a mental disorder or an emotional disorder. When we think about those disorders, the first, from our diagnostic perspective, and ICD-9 is somewhat different than our DSM. In the DSM, we don't have a diagnosis for those acute reactions in the first few hours or days after an event. But in the first month after an event, we have a diagnosis of acute stress disorder, which is primarily identified by the presence of a variety of symptoms that look strikingly like post-traumatic stress disorder. If they persist over time, then the diagnosis of PTSD will be made. And then just real quickly, the next slide, and I'll go into this more with the second part of my talk in a few weeks when we talk about treating PTSD. These are the next slide beyond this, please. These would be the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, again, using our diagnostic manual criteria. So we really today are focused more on those acute reactions, the things that in the initial continuum slide would be classified as reactions or as injuries rather than as an illness or a disorder. So the next slide presents a curve. These were data that were collected from United States service members while they were deployed into Afghanistan. And they really I'm using them primarily to illustrate that the more combat events that somebody experiences, the more different types of combat events that someone experiences, the more likely they are to have significant reactions that begin to approach a diagnostic level. So as people experience more and more combat over time, they're more likely to show symptoms that persist and may need to be addressed. The next slide, these are data from non-combat trauma survivors that illustrate that if you have significant symptoms during the first weeks after a traumatic event, what we would diagnose as acute stress disorder, you are considerably more likely to have persistent problems over time and be diagnosed with PTSD than you are if you don't have those intense reactions initially. So again, as we think about who we might need to attend to in the aftermath of a trauma, those who are having the most symptoms are probably the ones to pay the most attention to. Next slide. Again, just to illustrate that we've begun to identify warning indicators. Those who've had a traumatic brain injury, particularly one that knocks them unconscious or causes them to have an altered sense of mental state, that is a sense of confusion, are considerably more likely to also be diagnosed with PTSD. So if you have someone who has sustained a traumatic brain injury, a head injury that resulted in loss of consciousness, it's probably worthwhile to evaluate them for PTSD as well. And then if you go to the next slide, I often have been asked, what can we do to train our soldiers so that they don't develop PTSD? And I usually shrug my shoulders, and used to always shrug my shoulders, but it turns out there are things that seem to help reduce the likelihood of developing PTSD. They have to do with things we've known from the civilian world, primarily in the form of social support. But in our military, we talk to them about the preventive value of strong units and strong leaders. So tight, cohesive units are less likely to have individuals struggling with trauma-related symptoms. And units with strong leaders also seem to be they also seem to contribute to the soldiers in those units being less likely to develop PTSD. So it's not that we know nothing, it's just that the training they ask me about doesn't have to do with psychotherapy, it has to do with good military training. Next slide is simply a transition, gets us back to this idea of the stress continuum. So I'll ask just to go to the next slide. As we think about intervening in the aftermath of trauma and disaster, and much of this work has been done in the context of disasters, but has application to combat situations as well. The majority of the individuals that we'll be dealing with are not going to be struggling with a diagnosed disorder. They're not going to have PTSD in the immediate aftermath of the event. And so there are things that we can do to assist them, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. The balance of this talk is on these stress first aid and skills for recovery that we think can be very useful in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of an event. Next time when I come, I will talk about the evidence-based treatments for PTSD. When the symptoms persist over time, then there are approaches that can be useful to treat those symptoms. So, next slide, please. If we think about kind of the first steps to take when somebody has experienced a traumatic event, particularly when a group of people has experienced a traumatic event, we think about the importance of sharing information and educating them about the types of reactions that they're liable to experience. Again, as I said, the things that we call symptoms of PTSD are actually, in my mind, very much the normal reaction people have when they experience such an event. It's simply that those reactions persist over time, and we end up calling them a disorder. So it's normal for somebody having gone through a trauma not to sleep well for a few days, or to have recollections of that event intrude into their consciousness when they're trying to do something else. It's normal for them to be jumpy and on edge. These are all things that if they persist, we would call them symptoms of PTSD, but they're actually just reactions to traumatic events. And what we need to do then in that first stage is think about how can we reduce those reactions and the discomfort associated with them, and how can we support those people, and then how can we educate them about what they're liable to, what they are experiencing, and what they're liable to experience. So if you'll flip to the next slide, and then I'm going to ask you to click 7 times. Great. Oh, it's all there. Never mind. I was paying attention to mine, which has transitions. So, so we think about this model of what we're trying to accomplish in the immediate aftermath of the traumatic event, and I'm going to go through each of these ideas. In English, they all start with a C, which doesn't look like they all start with the same letter in Ukrainian. So easier for me to remember, I suppose. But it begins with the idea of checking and coordinating. That is, checking in with the individual and coordinating the effort. And then we'll go through each of these stages over the next several slides. So if I could go to the next slide, please. One more click. Oh, no, now you're going through my 7. So you'll have to click through all of those real quick. I apologize for this. I don't like transitions, but my colleagues do. So I suffer through them. One more after the green circle. There we go. Thank you. So what are we trying to accomplish here in terms of stress first aid? Well, we want to make connections with the individual. We want to restore as much as possible a sense of safety. Obviously, you can't always be safe when we're talking about situations where combat continues. If the individual is disoriented or distressed, we want to help calm them down and get them oriented. If possible, we'd like to connect them with sources of support in their environment. So again, hearkening back to one of my earlier comments, if a unit is together and can support one another, that's probably a good thing. So separating someone from his or her unit, if it can be, if you can not separate them, that would probably be a better idea. And then we want to help the person, the individual, meet their needs as best possible and foster a sense of confidence that they can manage what they're dealing with, and that they are not, they won't be struggling forever. Again, some of these will have more applicability to ongoing combat situations than others, but they all are kind of underlying the object of what we're trying to accomplish. So next slide. Initially, we want to make a connection with the individual, and that means asking open-ended questions and listening when they talk, and making sure that we're attending when they're sharing with us. So I have a list of things not to do on the next slide. We don't want to insist that the person talk or push them to give details of the event that they aren't comfortable doing. We don't want to suggest that they are not feeling or reacting in the way that they should be feeling or reacting. That is, there's not a right way or a wrong way that they respond. We want to be able to support them however they're responding. And we want to build on the strengths and the skills that they already have. So what has worked for them in the past, we want to push them towards now as well, rather than saying, oh, you must do it my way, or I have a skill that you need to use. We want to leverage and build on the skills that they already have. So the next slide is the flip of the coin, ways that we might approach people, respectfully, with interest and attention, acknowledging that what they're going through is challenging and difficult, and work with them to think of positive ways to cope with the situation, cope with what they're, not only the external situation, but the internal situation that they're experiencing. And then, if possible, offering opportunities to come together again to talk with them at a later point in time. The support that we're trying to offer is not necessarily going to be able to be done in a single conversation. We want to come back and talk to them again if possible. Not always possible, obviously. Next slide, just offering some basic ideas. When one approaches somebody who's been through a trauma, what they want is to know that they're being heard. So reflecting back their feelings, reflecting what you've heard and paraphrasing what you've heard to show that you're attending and listening to them can be extremely valuable. Next slide, please. Supportive comments, and I apologize, these are supportive comments that or comments that sound supportive in my language. I don't know that they translate all effectively. So I'm not going to go through each of them, but think of, what do you say to support one when they're going through a really challenging time, and how to do so in a way that's not accusatory, that's not challenging, but rather understanding and supportive of their experience. If I could have the next slide, please. We want to empower individuals to do what they can to address the challenges that they're facing. Again, we want to build on things that they have done previously and found useful previously. So very important to ask what has worked for them when they've had difficulties in the past. Are there things that they can think of now that might help them to feel better? And then if you have things that you wish to share, we find that it's helpful to share them, if at all possible, in a written format that the person can take with them, because quite frankly, they're not going to remember much of what you say in this first encounter. They're stressed, they're not processing information in the way that we do when we're sitting calmly and speaking to one another. So having something that they can take with them to remind them of either ideas that you've shared with them, or even if you have a chance to write down their ideas that they've generated, so that they can carry those with them as well. Next slide, please. If possible, if there's time, we want to balance the sharing of information and the planning of ways to move forward with the opportunity to sit and to process. And this is, at least for my students, one of the things they have the hardest time doing is to sit in a room quietly and listening while they're trying to conduct therapy. They all want to jump in and solve the problem. And sometimes silence is our best tool. And sitting with someone and letting them, even internally, without necessarily sharing, process what they're coping with can be quite valuable. So if you have the time, yes, we want to share ideas. Yes, we want to inform them. Yes, we want to help them find ways to cope, but we also want to give them space to sit. So next slide, please. So again, just thinking in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, for us, it's cover, think about safety, calm, think about relaxing or reducing their distress, connect you to the individual, also connect the individual with their support system. How can we encourage them to use skills they already have or provide them with new skills to gain competence, and then confidence that they can move forward. The next slide begins, and I hope, Oksana, do they have access to the slides after the presentation? Okay, so I'm not going to go through each of these, but I encourage you to take a look at them. What we're thinking about here are ways in which we can provide an increased sense of safety when that's possible. Again, many of these ideas which grew out of work with disaster survivors, so after an earthquake or a hurricane, may not apply as easily in ongoing combat situations. So I would not want to pretend that I could offer a combatant safety, but certainly encouraging them to think about relative safety and relative risk in different settings that they're experiencing can be useful. In terms of, next slide, please, in terms of calming, there are a number of tools that I've used with individuals to think about how to regain or either regain or gain a sense of calm. Again, limited by the setting, but if they're able to write or to even just do relaxed breathing exercise with them over a minute or two can help them to recognize that by controlling and managing their breathing, they can regain that a sense of calm, at least briefly. I've used imagery, I've used prayer, I've used mindfulness approaches. These are all ways that, depending on the setting, you might incorporate some of these skills into what you do with an individual to help them, again, particularly in situations where when you're meeting with them, they are experiencing high levels of distress. You want them to be able to interact with you and to process the information that you're sharing with them. If they are too aroused or too distressed, they won't be doing that effectively. So many of these actions are taken just to get them so that when they're sitting with us, that they are able to hear what we're sharing with them and to take that information in. Next slide, please. We talked about connection and who they gain support from, emotional support, as well as just being around friends and family if they're available. Encouraging connection with peers, which sometimes can be challenged by whatever the traumatic experiences that you're dealing with. But certainly often the most readily available source of support are going to be peers. And then if you're working with a group for a period of time, you can consider identifying volunteers within that group who can come forward and offer to support to their colleagues and their peers when necessary. Next slide, please. I've talked through a couple of these in terms of just helping people to calm down in the moment, but relaxed breathing and mindfulness skills can be useful beyond the interaction that you have with the individual to help them at other times when they're feeling stress. So maybe something that you would wish to teach them. We recognize that combat settings are not the best places to try and get sleep for a variety of reasons, but encouraging people to recognize the importance of sleep, and oftentimes the importance of sleep in the immediate aftermath of a particular event that brings them forward. There's a little bit of work. It's still, I would argue, preliminary, but a little work that suggests that the memory consolidation that happens during the first couple of sleep cycles after a trauma is related to the persistence of post-traumatic symptoms. And so if it's at all possible, if you have the chance to find a way to encourage someone to get a reasonable, I don't say good necessarily, but a reasonable amount of sleep in the aftermath of a trauma, that looks like it may be helpful. Again, I would say the data are preliminary at this point.
Dave, do you want to have them go ahead and click through this slide so it's visible on the?
Oh yes, I'm sorry, I was not paying attention again to the translated slide. Yes, go ahead and click through. Whoops, maybe it just didn't come through. The last one I'll talk about then is just encouraging, perhaps in the longer term, again, encouraging the building of communication skills. If social support and support of one another is as valuable as it appears to be, then ensuring that you can communicate both when one needs support, but also when one can offer support to another can be valuable. Next slide, please. Okay. And then finally, in terms of, in this section, not finally, I should say, in terms of competence, Again, encouraging not only attention to the sorts of skills that were on the previous slide, which are actually listed under the second heading there, the information heading there, but also thinking, are there others or additional care that's necessary for this individual? Do they need clinical or medical care? Do they need spiritual care? Are there others, veterans, for example, who might provide support? So again, thinking in terms of strengthening their ability to utilize the skills that they have, but then also reach out to others when necessary. Next slide, please. We used to talk about hope, and now we talk about confidence. I would argue that in disaster situations, hope kind of permeates all of these steps, trying to encourage people to think about moving forward from the disaster, the point of the disaster. But we also want them to gain a sense of their own, of confidence in their own ability to move forward and cope with what they're dealing with. And I think in many ways, the idea of confidence rather than hope is more applicable to our military members. They often think about what they're capable of doing and how to gain a sense of confidence over their ability to do that. So, but what's implied here is to encourage looking beyond what they've just experienced, either keeping them in the present or in the future. And I think that that is an important element of this as well. And I'm going to, the next slide simply talks about some of the advantages of this approach. I'm going to skip past that. I've already talked about many of them. And because the next slide opens the discussion of what we call skills for recovery. And you'll see that these guys, this is kind of like, okay, we've gotten out of the immediate aftermath of the event. We're now anticipating the next stage moving forward, or we've identified with someone with some significant, though perhaps not yet pathological, psychological problems. So we want to encourage them to be thinking about what are the next steps that might be necessary. And a number of approaches that are relatively easily described and shared with an individual, sometimes easily applied depending on the situation, but do seem to have the ability to move people forward. Basic problem-solving skills often can be useful, particularly when someone is facing a loss of resources after a disaster, for example. Being able to not become overwhelmed with all the things that need to be done, but rather taking a problem at a time and trying to move forward with a solution. Learning skills that help them manage their own reactions and encourage them to re-engage with activities that they used to engage in, particularly pleasant activities they used to engage in. Both ways of addressing mood shifts and depression and the like. And then again, I will point out the value of healthy social connections. So either reconnecting or connecting with new networks of support. You know, I've worked in the field of PTSD for 30 plus years now, and the one thing I'm really confident about is that trying to recover from a trauma alone is way harder than trying to recover from a trauma with support. And the data show that, and my experience with patients shows that. And so I will probably till my dying day encourage people to talk to others. We are social animals, as they say. Next slide, please. So again, same basic ideas at this stage of calming and connecting and becoming and recognizing one's own capabilities. The real reason for this slide is to encourage us to keep asking, as we're working with individuals over time, are they getting what they need in each of these areas? Are they finding themselves with the skills they need, or do we need to provide new skills? Are they able to calm themselves when they get upset, or do we need to work with them around that? So really the take-home point with this slide is it's on us to keep checking in and confirming that people are moving in the direction we would like to help them to move. And then a couple more slides just to wrap up. We do think that in terms of resilience, despite my question as to whether we can really teach it, that the data are growing. We have a growing set of studies that show that flexibility can be very valuable when trying to cope with these horrifying and potentially distressing situations. And so want to encourage, kind of underlying all of this work, the idea that we want people not to get stuck seeing the world in one particular way, but understand that the more they're able to approach the world flexibly, more they're able to approach a particular problem with flexibility and have different ways of trying to solve it, the better off they're liable to be. In terms of this approach, if you go to the next slide, it is evidence informed. We don't have a lot of data on it, but it builds on data that we do have. It seems to be usable across a number of different populations. Again, it relies heavily on the individual to help us to identify their needs, and then to help identify and learn new skills to meet those needs. Again, we do try and provide the information with handouts that allows them to continue to remind themselves, because they may not be able to find me very easily. They can pull the handout and read it. And then if we go to the next slide, which was really a transition slide for the longer talk. Oops, I'm sorry, this was the slide I was just on. If you'll flip to the next slide. Which really kind of talks about the difference between this idea of skills for recovery as opposed to mental health treatment. And as I said, this was a transition slide to get me into the mental health treatment, so we'll pick that up in a few weeks. But to emphasize that in terms of these recovery skills, we want them not to be seen as clinical. That is, that they can be provided at a community level, that they're focused on the immediate situation, on the goals that are present now, rather than something I'm trying to achieve months or even years from now that might happen in mental health therapy. These tend to be short interventions. We're not trying to maintain connection with them for a long period of time. We want to be able to give them something rapidly that they can use in the situation they find themselves in, and therefore they're more limited. We're not looking to solve all of the problems. We're trying to focus on what's going on in the here and now. So I believe the next slide should be the last slide. Oh, nope, you're gonna have to skip through this one. It's a repeat of a previous slide. And then you'll get to the Q&A slide, I think. So click through 5 times, I think, if I remember. There we go. And the link here, which is on our website at the Center for Deployment Psychology, is a group of resources that we pulled together from a number of different sources ourselves, the Veterans Administration here in the United States, some other sources as well, that offer additional information about these kinds of responses that we can offer in the immediate aftermath of an event, and you all might find useful. I apologize, they're not translated into Ukrainian, but they are available for anybody to take a look at or download. Thank you.
Добре, ми тоді запрошуємо до питань.
Okay, then Q&A session is open and we encourage you to ask questions. Dear participants, please raise your hands. Oksana, I guess you have some questions. Yes, let's start with them. Let's start with your questions and then we encourage people to jump in. Okay, yes, I have a list of a question. I have a question from Dmitra. Dmitra says, thank you very much for the lecture. What actions should be taken, in your opinion, to prevent the risk of moral trauma after the event? What can be done right after the event to prevent the risk of moral trauma?
So I'm not sure I have a good answer because the research in that area is still too young to know what to do in particular in the immediate aftermath. The interventions that have been developed for individuals where the sense of moral injury persists over time look very much like the interventions for PTSD. They involve revisiting in one way or another the event itself, either through writing or through discussion with a therapist, and then but they add in additional elements that are focused on the process of forgiveness, and sometimes this is about the individual forgiving themselves. Sometimes it's about seeking a sense of forgiveness from whatever they feel is needed in terms of their spiritual life. So I, for example, often will recommend that people who have this sense of moral injury perhaps speak to a spiritual leader or a spiritual guide, a religious leader, a priest, whatever is appropriate for their belief system. And that can be helpful, although I would encourage you to talk with whomever you refer them to make sure that they understand this idea of moral injury from a psychological perspective as well as from the spiritual perspective.
Дякую.
Thank you for the answer. Second question. If the leader is bad and the team, the group is not united, what a soldier can do, how the soldiers can help themselves or their comrades to avoid any consequences for their mental health?
So remembering that much of what we say when we speak from data is probability, not assuredness. Even soldiers in let's say bad units are not necessarily going to have mental health problems. We find that they can gain support often from, although the full unit may not be particularly supportive and cohesive, that they can find groups within that unit that support one another. And that's what I would encourage, is to reach out to, it may be, within your platoon, there may be disruption, but within your team, there may be strength, and to focus on that. Or maybe it's not your team, but there are members of other teams who can provide support. I think another way to approach that question is to think about individuals within units who are isolated even within that unit as being at risk. So one of my students just completed a study in which she found that for soldiers in the US Army, female soldiers felt much less sense of connection to their unit than male soldiers. And that to me would say that female soldiers in those units might be at greater risk because they're not supported by the unit as a whole. So I think rather than, because perhaps I don't have a great answer for when an entire unit is functioning poorly, that where we can expend perhaps our energy is in trying to identify soldiers who within a unit appear quite isolated or are quite isolated. Over.
Ще одне питання прийшло, ось поки ви відповідали.
Another question: what can a good leader do after harsh events for their subordinates?
I'm trying to think how to phrase this not in the negative. So there are things I think a leader should not do in the aftermath, which is to ignore the reactions of the unit members, right? Or to diminish those reactions. I think a good leader, probably regardless of setting, is one who is at least as concerned about those who are subordinate to that leader as that leader is worried about those who are his superiors or her superiors. And I think the problems often come when the leader is more worried about his leaders or her leaders' perceptions of them than they are about their subordinates' perceptions of them. So if you approach leadership from the perspective that, part of my job is to assure that that my troops are coming through this as well as possible, given the realities of war, then I think that's a good first step. One of my friends, a psychologist, deployed to Iraq in 2007 or thereabouts, and he described essentially his first day on the job, and a leader of one of the combat units asked that he come to the unit, and the leader pointed to the psychologist, and frankly, most troops think psychologists have 3 heads and do voodoo. So the fact that the leader introduced the psychologist to his troops and said, this is the guy who's going to help you when you need it. And the fact that that leader was able to recognize that part of his job was to look out for the mental health of his troops, not only the physical health of his troops, I think went a long way to aiding those soldiers to come out as best they could. Again, the realities of war are people will be injured and people will be killed and people will come away with psychological wounds as well. We can't prevent those, but we can do what is possible to mitigate them.
Dave, can I add to that answer 2 thoughts? One is the importance of the leader's presence. Often in these situations, leaders actually avoid being engaged with their troops. And then secondly, as you've described earlier, the ability to be present and listen. Those are 2 critical elements, especially when bad things have happened, when units have taken casualties, or maybe issues of what we call friendly fire, where mistakes have been made, things of that nature. But the leader's presence and the leader's ability to listen is critically important in those moments.
Thank you, Jim. I should have just turned to you in the first place.
Шановна аудиторія, чи є у вас питання, будь ласка.
Dear participants, do you have any other questions? I don't see any questions.
Dave, while we're waiting, Oksana, let me ask Dave a question that he could comment on, and that's the notion of, in a sense, the modern battlefield, where many soldiers may actually be engaged, but be miles away, responsible for flying drones or doing other kinds of things that can be extremely stressful. So your thoughts about the importance of thinking beyond simply the actual engaged combat at the front line, and thinking of the stress that soldiers may experience who may be distant from that.
So the easy answer for me, Jim, is that physical distance does not equate to emotional distance. And so I think there is a growing recognition here in the States that although our drone operators, for example, but this is true also for, howitzer operators who are miles from the target when they're firing their weapons, that they're not untouched by what's happening at the other end of whatever weapon they're using. So for example, our drone operators, we had actually just recently an experience of one who, after an extended tour of operating drones, and as was described, for our operators, it's often a process of tracking an individual over time to target them, and that individual then is no longer just a spot on a screen. That becomes a human being. And so when eventually it comes time to kill that human being, it's not dramatically different than killing a human being who's on the same battlefield and I'm looking into his or her eyes. And what we've the incident that I was reminded of was a service member who had spent some time doing this repetitively over months. I don't know how I remember how many months, but was so distressed by it that eventually he wound up dying by suicide. And so it's very much the case that the physical distance doesn't protect from these kinds of reactions.
That's very helpful.
Дякую. Так,
Thank you.
я уточню. Друга частина, яка присвячена ПТСР, у нас
Okay, let me remind you that second part of the lecture dedicated to PTSD will take place on 24th of November. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
добре.
Okay,
Тоді
good.
те, що стосувалось гострих стресових реакцій.
Like today we were talking about acute stress reactions, and the next part of the lecture
Відбудеться 24
on the
листопада.
24th of November will be dedicated to the interventions for PTSD, namely.
Ну що ж, тоді, я думаю, можна
Dear
завершувати
participants,
сьогодні.
if we have no other questions,
Дякую
we can
лекторам, дякую
finish
нашим
today's
учасникам.
event. Thank you very much, dear
Дякуємо
lecturer.
що допомагали
Dear
підготувати
participants,
і
we're
тоді
grateful
до
to our
зустрічі
interpreters for
наступної
their assistance
наступного
and
лекції.
see you at the next lecture. We will be happy to see
До
all of you.
побачення.
Have a
Гарних
good
вихідних.
evening and have a nice weekend. Take care. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.